Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Doctor's Lady by Jody Hedlund, narrated by Susan Hanfield. Chapter 1. February 1836. Angelica, New York. Indians! The sharp call from the back of the sanctuary jolted Priscilla White. She sucked in a breath and twisted in the pew. "Two of them!" shouted someone else. Additional cries of alarm erupted around her, and Priscilla strained to see the entrance of the church above the heads of the congregants behind her. Mary Ann's fingers bit into her arm. Priscilla patted her younger sister's hand and rose from the hard bench, just enough to get a glimpse of the wide-open double doors. Sure enough, 2 Indian boys stalked inside. "What shall we do?" Mary Ann tugged her. "Should we hide?" "Oh, shush now." Priscilla squeezed her sister's hand and tried to stop the trembling of her own. "They're just boys." The 2 lean youths started down the aisle with long, confident strides. Their braids dangled with beads and shells that clinked together. The fierce blackness of their eyes captivated her, and she couldn't look away, even though staring broke the rules of etiquette. With each step they took, they drew nearer the front pew where she sat with her family, and her heart pattered harder against her chest. Why were they here? What could they possibly want? Next to her, Mary Ann shrank into the wooden seat as much as her hugely pregnant frame would allow. The boys' fringed leggings swished, and their breechcloths flapped in cadence. Priscilla forced herself to sit straighter, to not shrivel like her sister. The taller boy's dark eyes slid to Priscilla for the briefest instant, and she was sure he could hear the rapid thumping inside her. The air in their wake carried the scent of melted animal fat and charred meat. She pressed a gloved hand against her nose and drew in a deep breath of the sweet mint that lingered in the satiny material. When the Indians reached the pulpit, they spun abruptly and faced the congregation. Almost on cue, they splayed their legs and folded their arms across their chests. A hush descended over the meeting house. The babbling of a baby several rows back reverberated through the eerie quietness. Reverend Lull stood unmoving, like a wood carving, his mouth partly open and his hand raised. For a long moment, Priscilla held her breath and, like everyone else, stared at the spectacle. There hadn't been a single Indian in Allegheny County during the 26 years of her lifetime. Who knew how long before that? And now there were 2. What was Providence planning for them? The decisive step of boots at the doorway echoed through the silence. Once again, Priscilla shifted in her pew. This time she took in the tall form of a broad-shouldered man. With the brim of his battered hat pulled low, she could see nothing but the shadowed stubble on his jaw. A twinge of trepidation wove through her stomach. His boot heels clunked on the wooden floor, and with each step forward, the thread pulled taut until, finally, when he reached the front and turned to face them, her stomach was as tight as the stitches in her sampler. With a flick of his finger, he tapped up his hat and gave them a clear view of his face. Blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, peered at them from a tanned, weathered face. "Forgive me, Reverend, for disrupting your service," he said, not bothering to look at Reverend Lull. Instead, his gaze swept across the congregation. There was something intense and passionate in his eyes, something that spoke of adventure and of daring deeds about which Priscilla could only dream. Mary Ann's fingers dug through Priscilla's gloves and pinched her tender skin. Priscilla absently patted her sister's hand, wishing Marianne's fear didn't mirror her own. Standing next to the savage Indians, the man seemed fierce, from the pistol at his waist to the scar that cut a thin white path from the corner of his left eye to his cheek. Who was this man, and what did he want with them? Priscilla pressed the knot in her middle. Yet even as she tried to still her quivering, she couldn't keep from trembling with the thrill of the unknown.
I'm Dr. Eli Ernest, and I've just returned from exploring Oregon country.
A doctor? Priscilla sat back against the hard bench. This fearsome, rugged man a doctor? She'd met with plenty of doctors over the past several years, and none had looked like this man. And none of them had been able to offer her any hope. An ache of emptiness swelled through her middle. She slid her hand away from her barren womb and tucked it in her lap. She forced herself to not think about the pain, about the fact that she'd never be a good and fruitful wife to any man. How many times must she remind herself to embrace God's plan for her life, even if it never included marriage and children?
John and Richard,
Dr. Ernest nodded toward the two Indian boys,
agreed to come back with me so I could show everyone just how kind and civil the Indians truly are.
The boys stared straight ahead, their expressions stoic. In their Indian attire, they looked anything but kind and civilized. The taller boy's eyes flickered to her again, and she caught a glimpse of curiosity in their depths before he glanced away. For an instant, she could almost picture him as one of her students. With a proper haircut and appropriate wearing apparel, perhaps he could grow to be more civilized. With the right teacher, he could quite possibly learn many things. Her heart quickened. Soon, very soon, she would have the opportunity to change lives for the sake of the gospel. She would get to teach heathens like this boy, only in India, where the need was greater than any other place on earth. Any day now, for she was long overdue to hear back from the mission board.
They are of the Nez Perce tribe, a peaceful and generous people,
Dr. Ernest continued.
I'll be traveling back to Oregon country in a few weeks' time, returning John and Richard to their home.
His voice had a rugged quality that matched everything about him, from his oil-slicked cloak and faded trousers to his scuffed boots.
This time I won't be coming back. The Nez Perce have asked me to set up a mission among them.
A mission? Her heart skipped forward, each beat tripping over the next, just as it did every time she thought about life on the mission field and the millions of heathens still needing the gospel.
John and Richard's father wants to help his people. They've seen the benefit of the white man's medicine and knowledge, so they've agreed to let me buy a portion of their land and build a clinic.
A mission in the far west? Everyone knew the land in the west was unfit for civilized life. It was a place inhabited by fur trappers, wild animals, and Indians. The rugged terrain made it nearly impossible for self-sufficiency. India, on the other hand, already had established missions and schools. They desperately needed more workers.
I've come today on behalf of the Board of Missions,
Dr. Ernest said,
to ask for your commitment of support. I've spent the winter visiting churches, raising funds necessary for our return travel and building of the mission. Now, with your support, I could raise the last of what I need.
A chorus of whispers broke the stunned silence that had prevailed since the appearance of the two Indian boys.
Reverend Lull finally moved. Well, welcome, Dr. Ernest. You've come to the right place. We certainly are a mission-minded congregation. We already support several missionaries. The women of our congregation have formed a female home missionary society.
He cleared his throat and directed his attention toward Priscilla, his face aglow with pride.
In fact, We have one of our own, my dear sister-in-law, who is planning to leave us to teach in India."
Mary Ann beamed at her husband, while Priscilla nodded and straightened her shoulders. The doctor gave her the briefest of nods, skimming over her with obvious disinterest before turning to survey the rest of the congregation again. She sat back in surprise and reached for the cameo pinned at her throat. Patting the twisted knot at the back of her head, she fought a strange sense of uncertainty. Had her hair come loose? Did she have something unseemly upon her face? Dr. Ernest cocked his hat back further on his head, revealing overlong, dusty brown hair with sun-bleached streaks.
"As I've repeatedly told the board, we Americans willingly pour our money and time into lands and people beyond the seas, but we neglect the need right on our back doorstep."
Did he think so highly of his own calling that he could dismiss her so easily?
"The natives of the North American continent need our generosity just as much, if not more, than any other group in the world."
Dr. Ernest rested a hand on the shoulder of the Indian boy closest to him.
"The Nez Perce are a wandering tribe, and live only on the food they can hunt or scavenge, and often they go hungry. They're vulnerable to attacks by the fierce Blackfoot tribe, who kill their people or enslave them. They're being exposed to the white men's diseases through the fur trappers, but don't have white men's medicine to help fight them."
His words elicited murmurs of sympathy. He nodded at the Indian boys, and they smiled back at him, as if they knew they were getting the response they wanted. Indignation shimmied up Priscilla's spine. Did he think being a missionary to the West was more noble and important than being one to India?
"Perhaps in holding out the hand of friendship to one tribe,"
he squeezed the Indian boy's shoulder,
"we'll begin to repair the damage we've done to so many others." "Amen,"
called several brothers and sisters. Priscilla pressed her lips together, wanting to speak, but forcing herself to raise her hand and wait for recognition. Dr. Ernest averted his gaze to the other side of the sanctuary.
"Miss White,"
Reverend Lull held out a hand to her.
"I'm sure we would love to hear your thoughts on this matter."
She stood and nodded her thanks to the Reverend. Then she bestowed her sweetest smile on Dr. Ernest. "What you are telling us is all well and good, Dr. Ernest, but how can we justify focusing our attention on one tribe when there are 600 million heathen throughout foreign lands who are perishing in sin and require our immediate help?" Mary Ann yanked Priscilla's dress, and Mother cleared her throat. They only meant to urge her into the silence and submission that behooved a woman of her status. Yet how could she stand back without defending the place and people she would serve until the Lord called her heavenward? "When those in foreign lands are already receptive and eager," she continued, "I don't see how we can do anything but pour our time and money into overseas missions, especially when others have already tried to share the gospel with the Indians and have failed to see any results."
"What can we expect from the natives we've forced to relocate?"
Dr. Ernest said, as he slowly pivoted until he faced her.
"Of course the Central Plains tribes are hostile to the whites and to anything they might offer."
Finally he looked at her. His eyes flickered with irritation, as if he was weary of rebuffing comments like hers.
"Thankfully, most of the tribes of the Northwest are still on friendly terms with the whites, and it's my desire to keep it that way."
"Yes, but why would we want to gamble on a mission in the West with savages when the mission board is desperate for qualified candidates to work in the missions they've already established overseas?" He studied her in calculated measures, starting at the tips of her soft leather boots, moving to the shiny muslin of her meeting dress, until he reached the intricately carved cameo at her throat. She tried not to squirm under the intensity of his crystal blue eyes. Instead, she forced herself to stand taller. He met her gaze squarely.
What would such a fine lady like you know of the harsh realities of mission life?
The bold question stole away her ready answer. What did she know? Except what she'd read and heard secondhand. I may not know everything, but I am quite prepared to give my life in service to the Lord's work. The words of the missionary herald echoed in her mind. A generation of heathen lives no longer than a generation of Christians. She might be a fine lady, but how could she sit back in comfort and ease when so many were heading for the everlasting torments of hell? Besides, many women of her status and background had already gone. Didn't the mission board continually say the most important qualities were the candidate's character, piety, and commitment? She lifted her chin. Fortunately, the mission board is quite adept in choosing their candidates. They use the utmost care to pick only the most qualified. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Ernest? How could he dare to disagree without casting doubt upon himself? His eyes narrowed, deepening the permanent crinkles at the edges.
The mission board needs to reevaluate its list of qualifications for women. They need to have stricter guidelines, especially for ladies like you.
I beg your pardon? Priscilla Jane White, Mother whispered. Enough. Every single letter of reference I obtained applauded my spiritual fervor, talent, education, and industriousness. Irritation gave liberty to her tongue, even though she knew she would suffer Mother's rebuke later. I am physically fit, energetic, and young. I'm eager to serve the Lord and save the lost. What more is necessary? A shadow fell across Dr. Ernest's face, and clouds flitted through his eyes.
My friend and fellow medical student, Dr. Newell, applied for a mission in India. He took his young bride, a delicate and refined lady like you. He'd been on the foreign shore less than a month when he had to send his bride back home in a coffin.
Priscilla's breath rushed in, echoing the startled gasps of those around her. She stifled a chill that threatened to crawl over her skin and shook her head, unwilling to let this stranger scare her from her calling. I've heard similar tales. The Missionary Herald doesn't hide the perils of mission life from its readers. For the first time, Dr. Ernest's lips cracked into a semblance of a smile, only it was stiff and almost contemptuous.
Ah, the glorious Missionary Herald. What would we do without it and all its glamorous reports of mission life?
Her confidence faltered, and for a moment she couldn't think of a rebuttal. She grew conscious of the fact that everyone in the congregation was watching their exchange, and she was making a scene unbefitting a lady. "Sit down, Priscilla!" Her mother's angry hiss pulled on her. Priscilla lowered herself, but couldn't stop from uttering one last word on the matter. "Dr. Ernest, I'm sorry your friend lost his wife, but she died in a glorious cause and surely went on to receive an unfading crown." His eyes widened, almost as if he were seeing her for the first time.
There's a good chance any missionary, man or woman, could end up a martyr, he said slowly. Unfortunately, the glorious cause seems to be partial to martyring inexperienced young ladies.
Her mother pinched her arm, and Priscilla pressed her lips together to refrain from further discourse. Let him have his morbid views of women missionaries. There was no sense arguing with a man she'd never see again, especially since they were headed to opposite ends of the earth. Why, then, did she feel compelled to prove herself to him? "My husband is giving Dr. Ernest a portion of the offering," Marianne whispered, peeking around the doorframe. "I certainly didn't mean to imply that we should shun him altogether." Priscilla stacked the Sunday school materials. "Do you think everyone thought I was uncharitable toward him?" The question had plagued her all through the children's lesson, and the satisfaction she normally drew from teaching had deserted her. Mary Ann ducked into the small room. "Well, I'm sure if you were uncharitable, it was only because he deserved it." Priscilla slid the bench against the wall. "You're right. It was his fault. If he hadn't been disparaging, I wouldn't have needed to rise to my defense." Mary Ann grimaced and grasped her bulging middle. Priscilla spun away, searching for something else to tidy, trying to ignore the sudden pang of longing in her chest. "Don't worry about me," Mary Ann said. "This happens all the time lately. Dr. Baldwin tells me I'm just having false labor pains." Priscilla's gaze slid involuntarily to her sister's stomach, to her fingers splayed there, to their slow circular caress. "I guess it's pretty common." Mary Ann stuck a fist into the lower part of her back and then arched. The waist of her dress pulled tight. "Enjoy your girlish figure while you still have it. I've heard that it's gone forever after the birthing." The sting in Priscilla's chest swelled into the base of her throat. Once again, she glanced around the room, needing something else to look at, anything besides her sister's swelling body. If she could give up her girlish figure, she certainly would. She shook the thought from her mind and tried to muster a smile for the two young girls who'd stayed behind to help her pick up. "What would I do without my helpers?" She forced cheerfulness to her voice. The girls smiled. "If I could, I'd pack you in my trunks and take you to India with me." They giggled. "Teacher! Miss White!" A young boy's urgent call sent her heart into a dash. She rushed across the room. When she stepped into the sanctuary, she averted her eyes from the adults still meeting for their class. She pressed a finger against her lips, signaling for the boy, one of her Sunday school students, to be mindful of disturbing the question and answer time the congregation was having with Dr. Ernest. "Miss White!" The breathless boy dashed toward her, wiping his red nose across his coat sleeve. "It's my brother Rudy. He's hurt bad." "Oh, dear." Anxiety put a hustle into her efforts to retrieve her heavy winter cloak and follow the boy outside. Clutching fistfuls of her dress, she strode across the wide lawn, her boots squishing into the February mixture of old snow and new mud. When she reached the boys surrounding Rudy, she was puffing. "I shouldn't have let you children out early." They hung their heads and moved back to let her approach the boy sprawled upon the ground. She stepped into the circle, took one glance at Rudy's face, and gasped. She could only stare with a sickening roll of her stomach at the smears of blood. But when his eyes opened, she read the pain in them and dropped to her knees beside him. "Rudy, what happened?" The boy managed to groan, the white of his eyes bright against the grime. Blood oozed from a gash above his eyebrow. She slipped her hand under her cloak to her pocket. Her fingers fumbled at the drawstring, trembling in her haste to retrieve the handkerchief she kept there. "Tell me what happened, boys." She swallowed a swell of bile. "We were having a snowball fight," Rudy's brother offered. "I guess some of the snowballs ended up having a few rocks in them." "Ended up?" She gripped the crisply pressed cloth with its perfectly creased edges and hesitated for only a moment before lowering it against the boy's gash. Rudy winced. Priscilla jerked back. "Oh, I'm sorry." "No. Press it hard." Dr. Ernest's command was soft and accompanied a rustling next to her. She glanced sideways, and the clear eyes of Dr. Ernest met hers. "We need to stop the blood flow." He knelt next to her. "Once we slow the bleeding, I'll be able to take a look at the damage." She nodded and dabbed the handkerchief against the gash. "Harder." She pushed. Rudy squirmed and clenched his teeth together. "Keep pressing," Dr. Ernest said calmly. At the blood, the dirt, the loose flesh on Rudy's head, her stomach rolled, and she wanted to drop the cloth and scramble away before she embarrassed herself. But she forced her fingers to stay in place, until a splotch of bright red seeped into the linen and spread like the fringes of a web. Dr. Ernest combed strands of hair away from Rudy's forehead.
Guess you boys learned a lesson.
They nodded mutely. Priscilla took a steadying breath, knowing she had to stay and prove that even though she was a lady, she could withstand the discomfort of viewing an injury. And if she could stay poised during the situation, she could surely withstand the harsh realities of missionary life. Dr. Ernest's long fingers wove through Rudy's hair and then moved to his face, brushing at the mud and pebbles. She tried not to stare at the multitude of white scars that slashed across the tanned flesh of Dr. Ernest's hands, but the puckered lines drew her attention. He'd certainly suffered incredible trauma to acquire so many lacerations.
"You're doing fine,"
he said to Rudy. After another minute, he spoke again.
"Let's have a look at the damage now, shall we?"
She hesitated, and then lifted the bandage, making a point of focusing on Dr. Ernest's face and not the oozing wound. His wrinkled forehead framed tender but probing eyes.
"Son, you'll need a handful of stitches, but other than that, it's safe to say you'll live."
Rudy gave the doctor a tremulous grin.
"I've got my supplies at Dr. Baldwin's house."
He pushed a clean portion of the handkerchief back against the wound.
"Hold this tight and head on over there so I can stitch you up."
Dr. Ernest hefted himself to his feet, then reached a hand toward Priscilla. He towered over her. He neglected his cloak, and his shirt stretched against the hard strength of his arms and shoulders. If she hadn't witnessed the gentleness of his hands, she wouldn't have believed a man of his magnitude capable of it. She placed her hand into his, and when his fingers closed around hers, she drew in a sharp breath. His touch was gentler than she'd imagined. Without any effort, he drew her upward until she stood. This time, when his gaze met hers, a hint of humor crinkled the corners of his eyes.
"You did a good job holding yourself together."
Was he mocking her? The tiny crook of a grin answered her question. "I'm a teacher, Dr. Ernest, not a doctor's assistant." She tugged her hand out of his grip.
"Eli, you and Miss White make a good team."
Dr. Baldwin clapped Dr. Ernest on the back.
"Well, you know me. I prefer working by myself."
Priscilla glanced at the crowd that had gathered, and a rush of embarrassed heat pulsed through her. She was making another spectacle with Dr. Ernest. Taking a step away from him, she shook the folds of her cloak and brushed at the mud clinging to the embroidered edges. Mother moved next to her and narrowed her eyes at Dr. Ernest before handing Priscilla the glove she'd dropped in her haste to leave the building.
"You're a mess."
Mother tucked a strand of loose hair behind Priscilla's ear. "I'm fine."
"And you've soiled your dress."
Mother frowned at the soggy spot in her skirt.
"Hate to be the one to tell you this, ma'am."
Dr. Ernest's grin crooked higher.
"But a little mud and blood is hardly the worst of what your daughter will experience when she gets to India."
Mother lifted her nose and peered at him over the top, evaluating him from his head to his boots. Then she sniffed and clutched Priscilla's arm.
"Come now, dear. Let's get you home and cleaned up."
"Speaking of India," Dr. Baldwin said, stepping toward them, "I've got a letter for you, Miss White." Priscilla froze. Even her heart floundered to a stop. "I've just returned from a board meeting in Prattsburg with Dr. Ernest." The old doctor handed her an envelope. "The board asked me to deliver this to you." Excitement clutched her middle and twisted it. She took the letter and tried to stop the sudden shaking of her hands. Finally, the board had made its decision. She had no doubt they'd approved her for mission work. Everyone had told her she was an ideal candidate for one of the rare teaching positions they assigned to unmarried females. The board had made it clear they preferred sending married couples to the mission field. But she'd explained in her correspondence that she would never marry. If they wanted to use her...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?